Hello, everyone. This is Professor Joyeli, and this is our lecture on the ecology of sugar, slavery, and the plantation. This is part of our module on the Columbian Exchange, and some of the topics and themes are covered in Marx's textbooks, Origins of the Modern World, but I wanted to dive in a little bit more specifically because this is actually tremendously important to a lot of the topics we'll be discussing in the next few weeks. And also, there's a lot of room here to think specifically about the role of power and violence in the construction of the Columbian Exchange. So, in terms of our outline, first we're going to define what we mean by plantation, then talk about sugar and the Columbian Exchange, discuss the role of the transatlantic slave trade in this ecological system. We'll talk more about the slave trade in class this week, and then finally talk about the ecology of the sugar plantation. And this is actually the first part of discussion of the ecologies of plantations that we'll do throughout the semester. So what do you think of when I say the word plantation? To many Americans, this conjures up a specific set of ideas, and these different oftentimes depending on our race. To many white Americans, the idea of the plantation is a wonderful old house that was oftentimes built in the 1700s and 1800s on a beautiful piece of land in the South. And this conjures up what we call Old South ideas of chivalry and womanhood and a sort of agricultural and pastoral, not quite utopia, but a sort of halcyon view of the old world. And many of these plantation houses have been restored and you can tour them. But what's really interesting about these, many of them, it's changing, but many of them, is that they present a very glossed over view of what life was like on these plantations. A lot of them get this view from many received narratives and memories about what the quote Old South was like. And for many people, these visions of the Old South come from TV and movies, none more so important than Gone with the Wind, the movie from 1939 based on the bestseller by Margaret Mitchell. And Gone with the Wind talks about Rhett Butler and Scarlett O'Hara, and it depicts a very saccharine and sanitized view of life was like on the plantation, and it makes Southerners during the Civil War and Reconstruction look like people who were oppressed by the Yankees, and it really sidesteps the issue of slavery completely and makes enslaved African Americans look like loyal and supportive house servants. But we know that in reality, plantation life was much different than it is depicted on American plantation tours or in many TVs and movies. Plantations were first and foremost productive economic places. They were environments and farms that were focused on monocropping, growing 1 to 2 crops for cash focused export markets, oftentimes thousands of miles away. They were always dependent on unfree labor, usually forced and usually racialized. Enslaved African Americans or indigenous people, sometimes indentured servants, and then later in the history of plantations, what was known as coolie or debt peon labor, oftentimes from South Asia. Plantations were not just quaint little farms, they were capital intensive productive enterprises. It took tens of thousands of dollars in the 19th century to start a plantation and to run a plantation. And perhaps most importantly, plantations were built on violence. Violence towards the land. They were very destructive towards local ecologies, violence towards animals, and particularly violence towards people. The entire act and process of enslavement was constantly built on killing and violence towards human beings. Now, we want to think about the ecology of the sugar plantation. We want to put it in the context of the Columbian Exchange, that broader exchange of animals and plants and microbes that begins around 1500. And we're thinking specifically about that exchange of sugarcane. Sugar during the ancient times and medieval and early modern times was a tremendously valuable sweetener. Many regular people only used honey or fruits or other types of plants to sweeten their foods. Sugar coming from sugar cane was tremendously valuable because it was only grown in certain areas. But during the 1600s and 1700s, sugar becomes more and more popular throughout the emerging middle class of Europe. This is a great picture of two ladies and an officer drinking tea in 1700s England. And if you know anything about the British way of drinking tea, they drink tea with milk and with sugar. I show this picture because it's important for us to connect the consumption of these new world agricultural goods to different places in Europe and across the Atlantic Ocean. At the end of the day, when we see people drinking tea with sugar, we need to remember that their consumption is connected to these broad and vast networks built on exploitation and violence. So I mentioned before that sugar itself actually comes from the Mediterranean. In reality, sugar is originally domesticated in South Asia, India, and present day Pakistan around the time of the 5 to 600 AD. It travels across the Middle East to the Mediterranean during the medieval and early modern times. And during this period in Europe, it is only consumed by the elites. But then, around 1500 and 1600, the Portuguese in the Atlantic islands of Madeira and the Canary Islands pioneer a new type of sugar production known as the sugar plantation. The Portuguese are looking to make these areas into productive enterprises, but they realize that they can't grow normal crops that can grow in Portugal. But the warm and tropical climate is perfect for growing sugar. And so they set up these sugar plantations. But what they soon realize is it's very hard to convince people to work on these plantations because the wages are very low. So what they begin to do is enslave people. It's hard to enslave people from Portugal, obviously, but it's easy to tap into existing networks of enslavement already in the coast of Africa. The Portuguese and later the British pioneer the system of enslaving Africans. And as Marx talks about, much of this original enslavement was done by Africans themselves, who would then trade these enslaved peoples to Portuguese, British, French slave ships, and then they would be shipped all the way across the Atlantic. We'll talk more about this in class, but this is an example of a slaving fort, the Cape Coast Castle in Ghana. It still exists today. You can visit it. It's a heritage and memorial site. It was originally built by the Portuguese and then rebuilt, this building, by the British. And what would happen was is that over a couple of months, captains of slave ships would purchase enslaved peoples, keep them in jails and in prisons and the basement of these buildings, and then eventually, once they had 200 to 300 enslaved peoples, they would begin the journey across the Atlantic Ocean in what's known as the Middle Passage. And this is a diagram that shows us where the roughly 11 million enslaved peoples from 1500 to 1900 went between Africa and the New World. And you can see here the vast majority went to Brazil and the Caribbean. Why? Because of the massive demand to go on European sugar plantations. This is the end of part one. So if you want to take a small break here, this is a long video. Take a break, take a breath, and then we will go into part two. For part two, we will think about the actual ecology of the sugar plantation. In order to understand the ecology, we need to think a little bit about the nature of labor on those plantations. Laboring on a plantation was tremendously arduous, but the labor on the sugar plantation was considered to be some of the most arduous and destructive. Sugarcane could actually be planted and harvested year round. Sugar planters would time their crops to be rotated, so they were only harvesting certain plots of land every few months, so they could be constantly growing and harvesting sugar. This meant during those harvesting times, labor was tremendously arduous because once the sugar was ready to be harvested, it had to be harvested and processed relatively quickly. We can see a quote here from a reverend who observed how hard the work was for enslaved persons, but also this artistic depiction of a Haitian zombie. Haiti, the present day nation of, was known as Saint Domingue during the time of sugar plantations. It was a French colony, and it was one of the most productive but also exploitive colonies in the New World. The idea of the zombie is traced to African religious traditions, but many historians argue that it also has its origins in the experiences of enslavement. Imagine if you ever have worked for days at a time with very little sleep. After the third or fourth day, you feel like your eyes are sunken into your head. You're just sort of wandering around. You feel like you're dispossessed from your body. This is how people felt, and when you combine these with certain African spiritual traditions, these emerge into the tales and legends of the zombie. These ideas actually made their way to the Americas, to the United States in the early 20th century, and then are adapted from Haitian folk tales to Hollywood movies in the 50s and 60s, and eventually move into the modern culture of the zombie in the 1990s and early 2000s. The nature of work on the plantation is one part of that ecology of the plantation. The other part of that is to understand the physical nature of the plantation itself. We can see here this plot of the map of Fort Plantation of Barbados from 1646. This quote from John Hapcote shows us how this plot representeth the form of 300 acres of land of a plantation, called the Fort Plantation, owned by Captain Thomas Middleton of London, who hath purchased. This map gives us a little bit of really important detail because we can see how the dark green plots are where the sugarcane was actually planted. This is interspersed with the forested landscape. And what the plantation owners would do was they would clear off forested land to plant new actual plots of sugarcane and intersperse this with the deeply entrenched plots. Also, this quote here is actually instructive because it implies that this is what is an absentee landlord that owns the plantation. And that's very important. The white residents of many of these plantations, islands such as Saint Domingue or Jamaica or Barbados, they didn't have enough money themselves. They were absentee landlords, very wealthy people from back in France or Portugal or England who would purchase these and finance these. This is a picture of a sugar works. Now, when during harvesting time, they would take the sugar cane and they would, on the top right there, you can see the actual sugar mill. This would be used to squeeze out the juice from the sugar cane. This would then drip down into a little runway and then go to the boiling works, which is on the left. And then over the course of a few hours, that sugar cane juice would be boiled down to a thick, viscous liquid. Once this was thick enough, then it could be distilled into sugar. There would be two different products. The first would be sugar crystals themselves, and these would be what would be very similar to what we would call brown sugar or muscovado sugar. It would be sugar crystals, but it'll be brown in nature. And then the runoff from this would be known as molasses. Now, this would be further refined in two different ways. The molasses would be used and distilled into rum, an alcoholic product, which would be very valuable. The muscovado or brown sugar will be packed and sent to England, where it will be further distilled again into fine white sugar. In order to understand the ecology of the plantation, it's best to think about the destructive aspects of the ecology and how it caused massive amounts of disease. So when land was cleared for planting and fuel, it would hundreds or thousands of trees would be cut down along the plantation. The removal of these plants and trees would cause increased flooding and standing water during rainy seasons. This would cause massive soil erosion, which decreases soil fertility and causes biodiversity loss. But once you have all of this massive clearing of plants and trees, this would lead to lots of standing water. And when you have lots of standing water, especially in a rainy season, what do you get a profusion of? Mosquitoes. Mosquitoes love to breed in standing water. Mosquitoes themselves are not harmful. They're harmful because of the diseases that they can transmit between humans and from animals to humans, particularly two diseases, yellow fever and malaria. Yellow fever and malaria can both be very destructive. Yellow fever is destructive because it has extraordinarily high mortality rate, up to 50%. But if you catch yellow fever and survive, you're immune for the rest of your life. Malaria can be very destructive. Malaria only has a death rate of about 10, 15 to 20%. But when you catch malaria, you keep it for the rest of your life. But Some people actually have inherited immunity to malaria, and that comes from the sickle cell blood cell. We'll talk more about that in a second. So, when we talk about the susceptibility of people on a plantation to yellow fever and malaria, we need to think about what's known as the epidemiological triad. This is the triad of the agent, the host, and the environment. Follow the fireman's mantra: a fire requires air, fuel, and heat. Now, in a plantation, what you saw was an increase of an environment which makes people much more susceptible to yellow fever and malaria. Why is this? Well, first of all, people are being worked extraordinarily hard, which means they are malnourished and they are tired and they're more susceptible to getting sick. Also, you have an environment where the trees and the plants are being destroyed. Lots of standing water means more mosquitoes, which means you have more hosts spinning around. This means that on these plantations there were spikes in cases of yellow fever and malaria, but not all people who lived there were equally susceptible. People who came from Europe, especially Northern Europe, France, and England, were particularly susceptible to malaria and yellow fever, and they would die in droves. People from sub Saharan Africa, enslaved peoples, were also susceptible to malaria and yellow fever, but because yellow fever and malaria were endemic to sub Saharan Africa, many people came over to Brazil and the sugar islands of the Caribbean with a certain amount of inherited but also acquired immunity. This is important because this inherited and acquired immunity to these diseases causes Europeans to value the labor of enslaved Africans more, which is going to help ramp up the transatlantic slave. Now, I just mentioned before how a lot of the sugar production begins in Brazil in the 1600s, but by the 1700s and 1800s, it transfers to the sugar islands of the Caribbean. This plantation system will continue to move north. In the 1600s and 1700s, first it'll go to British North America along the coast in places like Virginia and North Carolina, where you'll have plantations that will be built around tobacco. And eventually, as we'll see in a few weeks, it will move throughout the American Southeast to plantations built on. In conclusion, the modern plantation system was developed from sugar cultivated in the Caribbean and Atlantic islands, which then spread to Brazil and the Caribbean. Sugar was in high demand as a sweetener in Europe, which caused sugar plantations to spread through the Western Hemisphere. The labor demand for sugar is what opens up the transatlantic slave trade. Sugar plantations created unique ecological systems that dominated and destroyed both nature and human lives. And the plantation model would spread across the Western Hemisphere to the Caribbean and then the United States.